let's get started. I'd like to welcome anyone viewing this presentation. This is an interview with 3 former or retired naval officers, and we're going to be investigating the topic, excoriating toxic leadership in the U.S. Navy. So some of the things that we want to look at, just the challenges in addressing this issue, some possible solutions, changes that might be made within naval culture in order to successfully address the topic. The idea of deeply, I just want to add, the idea of deeply addressing this topic belongs to our featured commentator, John Cordle, and offering support and insight our panelists, Kirk Benson and Nicole Waybright. So I'll just take a minute to introduce the 3 members. Dr. John Cordle is retired from the United States Navy after 30 years of service. He retired in 2013 at the rank of captain. He commanded the cruiser, the USS San Jacinto, and the destroyer USS Oscar Austin during Operation Iraqi Freedom, receiving a Bronze Star. In 2010, Dr. Cordle was the recipient of the U.S. Navy League's Captain John Paul Jones Award for Inspirational Leadership. He has written extensively on topics of leadership and also sleep deprivation in the Navy. Kirk R. Benson retired from the United States Navy in 2007 after 20 years of active duty service as a surface warfare officer. He is currently a senior naval civilian employee. Our third panelist, Nicole Waybright, is a former naval officer and author of the book Long Way Out. So we'll get started with our interview. We'll start with John, although Kirk Benson, Nicole Waybright, free to comment at any time or suggest additional directions we need to go along the way. But let's get started with a question for John. John, you have an extensive, long-standing interest in leadership topics, fatigue, human factors in performance, and the like. When did you become interested in the problem of toxic leadership? And can you give us your definition of this idea, toxic leadership?
Okay, great question. And the first part's pretty easy. The second part, it could be kind of tough because I think it invokes different feelings and different interpretations in different people. Certainly, my interest in leadership started very young. You look at leaders in your life, whether it's coaches, teachers, parents in the Navy. You meet people who are solid, positive leaders, and you meet people who are negative leaders. And I was exposed to a pretty wide array of them. Didn't really understand sort of how they get that way or how to compare them. Had a couple of what I would call, I don't think I would call them toxic leaders, but certainly challenging leaders as a junior officer, and then saw some of the effects of some what I would have to call toxic leadership in some of my other experiences in the Navy. And it wasn't until I actually read Nicole's book that it brought back to mind some experiences from the Navy as far as really digging into this topic a little deeper and looking back at my own experiences through her lens. And then through that, met Kirk, who was mentioned in her book, who really sort of rounded out the discussion. So toxic leadership, I guess, sort of manifests itself is more about what it does than what it is, in my mind. And that is, what it does is it sort of takes advantage of the attributes of leadership, which is sometimes either positional or authoritative power, and misuses it, whether it's to the advantage of the individual or the organization, and to the disadvantage of the people who work in that organization. And to really be defined as toxic, I would say it has to have destructive effects on the individuals who are subjected to it. I think some of the cases we're going to talk about here really drove home to me how true that is, and how hard it is to recognize at the time from outside this, especially for a ship, which is a very self-contained infrastructure, and how the effects of it can go on for a lifetime, but also generationally can affect an entire generation of crew members or officers on a ship. And so I guess that's the closest I can come.
Okay. I know that you recently read Nicole's book, Long Way Out, which deals in part with a high-profile case of toxic leadership, the history and relieving of command of Holly Graf. You have written that you found that difficult to read. As you read that chronicle, could you talk a little more about your reaction, especially to the long-term nature of her command and how she rose through the ranks unchecked?
Sure. So, I read that book and I looked back through my career, and I actually had some interactions with that individual in both the schoolhouse environment and in the waterfront, and had certainly heard some troubling reports and rumors from people who had served with her or under her. At the time, either I didn't feel like I was in a position to do anything about it, or I can't even say that I didn't choose not to do something about it just because it wasn't really in my lane, it wasn't my business, if you will. But then when it came back to fruition, and you're probably familiar with the story that after Nicole's interactions, this individual went back to command again, and then in the final weeks of an 06 command tour was relieved, but never really punished, if you will. That kind of got me to thinking about what could be done differently, what could have been done earlier in that person's career. How could we put safeguards in place to recognize people who have that leadership style, and find a way to remove them from leadership, so that they don't inflict that sort of damage on other people.
Yeah, and those are some questions I want to ask you about later, exactly what those safeguards might look like. Kirk, I had a question for you, also regarding Holly Graf's command. I know you have written that the Navy failed in dealing with her and her problems, and that you had some regrets along the way, wishing you had done more to address the problem as it was happening on your ship. Can you tell us what you would have done differently in hindsight? And can you maybe start by telling us a little about your role in her command and what that experience was like?
Yeah, absolutely, Jim. Thank you. So I was the combat systems officer aboard USS Curtis Wilbur in Yokosuka. Lieutenant Commander Graf was our XO. I served under her for about 18 months, along with Nicole, who was our gunnery officer. And as the senior department head, senior watch officer, I dealt with Commander Graf directly on a daily, hourly basis. And she definitely, in my opinion, was a toxic leader. Her leadership was very destructive, not only in the wardroom, the chief's mess, but the crew. Morale was rock bottom. And as a career SWO, surface warfare officer, we were always taught, you don't take your problems outside the lifelines of the ship. And I stuck to that because I thought was the right thing to do. Looking back, it wasn't. As the senior department head directly below the XO, I believe I should have went right to the destroyer squadron commodore and told him what I knew and what I've observed. And I never did that. Now I know that our destroyer squadron chaplain came aboard and wrote us, and he saw firsthand. He was a friend of mine, actually. We spoke at length, and he saw the things that she was doing to be destructive in her leadership style. And I thought for sure after this one particular underway period that, she was going to be relieved within days, and it never happened. And I know for a fact that, the ship had a reputation in Yokosuka. We would walk around fleet activities Yokosuka with our Curtis Wilbur ball cap on, and people would make comments like, "Oh, you're from Curtis Wilbur," and they knew of the reputation. And I know several, if not all, the other ship commanding officers knew about the reputation and the low morale on that ship. I know the Commodore had to know something. He had been on board as well. And I do believe that the Navy leadership, all the way up the chain of command, starting with our commanding officer, failed by addressing her toxic leadership. And there's no way, in my opinion, that she should have ever been promoted to commander or captain and had command of two warships.
Yeah, if I could just add, as Kirk stated, I was on board as a gunnery officer the same time Kirk was and served under Lieutenant Commander Graf. Without getting into the weeds of this, but we'll address some of these topics later in the interview. But I think that there's also issues with the culture of surface warfare, as Kirk talked about, where you wouldn't go outside the lifelines. And that in some ways, maybe not to the degree of what occurred under Lieutenant Commander Graf, but there's in some ways, these sort of toxic leaders I experienced, there was another department head on board, some of these people were the most successful in rising up in their career path. And so I think there was just sort of sort of cultural issues with this generation after generation after generation. It seems, I can't speak for the fleet at this moment, what is going on, but that this is sort of, this behavior in a way is accepted. This, the quote, this, slow eat their young, the screamers, things like that. So I just, wanted to add that that was sort of my experience as a junior officer, and what I took away from the Navy. And fortunately, I found things to be very different in industry. But I still look back all these years later, decades, amazed at how I would hear stories, and that sort of leadership was accepted on some level.
Right. So I'll just chime in for a second, and thanks for the stories. But I'm pretty close to the Navy right now, and I would say that I think it's better. I think some of the those traits have been weeded out, and some of the leadership. Certainly, many of my peers and friends are leaders now in uniform still, and certainly there has been a shift. However, one of the things that got me interested in this article was talking to a current naval officer who related a similar story, and basically paralleled what Nicole had told me from not that long ago. And the exact same piece of it was a high performing ship with a high performing captain, with lots of reports, but then at the end of the day, sort of either protected or in the weighing of leadership style versus accomplishments won out over leadership style. And in this case, this person was never really taken to task for it. Went to another command, and at that point, this officer literally broke down when she saw that this other officer had gone on to a higher command level, and decided to leave the Navy. So, I think in this forum, I'll stay away because there was no conviction, there was no formal documentation. I'll stay away from specifics, but it wasn't that long ago, and there were certainly lots of parallels here, both in the 05 command to 06 command, and in the reaction of the Navy to someone who apparently was delivering the results of an operational ship meeting its requirements at the expense of the crew.
And I'll also add, Jim, that Commander Graf had a reputation. Even before she got there, her predecessor as XO was a really good XO overall. He went on to make 2 stars. Great leader, great ship handler. But before Commander Graf even got to the ship, her reputation, we knew about her. We knew she was coming. She was 2 years ahead of me at the Naval Academy. Now, when you're a plebe at the Naval Academy, the second class, they're going to yell at you. She was in a neighboring company. And, in my opinion, and my observations of her back then, 1983, 84, she was a screamer, with the term we use in the SWO community for some leaders. And then when she got to the ship, I mean, from day one, literally day one, me as a senior department head, kind of being her person to show around the ship and things like that. I mean, it started immediately, just her brash leadership. But I also knew when she was in command of the Winston Churchill, I knew her XO. She did not change. She was the same person. This was not an isolated incident. That's what I'm trying to get to. And of course, on the USS Cowpens, I mean, she was relieved for physical abuse and mental abuse. So it wasn't just a one-time thing. It carried on, I believe, throughout her career.
And I think that's important to note that in addition to the testimonials here in this forum, she was convicted of cruelty via formal Navy process, and so it's not it's on the record. And I'll tell you what sort of drew my attention to Kirk, and I didn't know him at the time, was an episode in Nicole's book where he literally got to the point where he had to be taken off the ship because he was under such pressure. And I don't know if you want to talk about that, Kirk, in this forum, but it was something that really sort of, to me, drove home the personal nature of this and the impact of it.
I can certainly talk about it. I mean, it's been 20 years now, but I was under a lot of pressure. I believe that I took the brunt, or at least I was the first person she could reach out to all the time, because she held me responsible for the entire crew in the wardroom. And it was just a really bad time. And I ended up hurting myself to get off the ship. And looking back, I've lately been going through my medical record and reading all the things about what happened on August 12th of 1998. And I remember the date. And, I think, I regret doing that, but I think I would do it again to leave that ship. I mean, I left my tour about 9 months early, but I think it could have been something worse, if I hadn't have done that. And it's not something I'm proud of. It's very embarrassing, actually. Nicole was one of the first people I told her about it when she was writing the book, and it's in the book. But I believe it actually saved me because things were that bad. I remember driving into the base in the morning and thinking, driving my car and seeing a telephone pole and remember, just thinking like, if I turn the wheel and crash into that telephone pole right now, I won't have to go face Commander Graf today. And that's on the edge of suicidal. And I consciously realized what I was thinking, and I knew it wasn't the desirable thought, but that's what I was thinking. And I never did that, but that's kind of scary. It scared me. And I've been to a lot of counseling since I left that ship. And even 20 years later, when I talk about it too much, I get really uptight and shaky, to be honest.
Well, Kirk, thanks. I didn't mean to.
Destruction of toxic leadership. That's what it does to a person.
Well, thanks for sharing that, and I apologize if I
That's okay.
Sort of picked a scab there. But I think it's important. I felt like people react to stress in different ways. Some turn to alcohol, some turn to physical abuse of someone else, some become self-destructive, and sometimes it's a mechanism to just release. And we never know how people are going to result. And in my current job as a human factors engineer, there's always questions about, well, what was the cause of that emotional reaction or that stressful reaction? And often it's very difficult to put it in tangible terms and show a cause and effect. And so, it's important, I think, to understand just how personally destructive this is. And you're talking not about someone who was emotionally weak or inexperienced or, this is I've been the senior department on the ship. You're really carrying that ship, right? You're writing the watch bills, you're qualifying the sailors, you have to be a filter of that toxic leadership so that it doesn't flow down. And in doing so, it lands on your shoulders. And so I think that's what we saw. And at some point you break, and it's nothing, we're human, right? But empathy is required somewhere to be a leader. And I think that's a piece of this puzzle that maybe could be expounded upon.
And one thing about that particular incident, John and Jim and Nicole, I mean, that's nothing I planned. I didn't wake up that morning thinking I'm going to do this to leave the ship today.
Yeah,
It just happened. It just, I mean, I broke. I mean, you know, did I, you know, call it insanity? I don't know what it was, but it just happened. But like I said, looking back, I'm not sure that I regret it. I mean, you know, I wish it never happened. I wish I could have dealt with it or was in a better environment for sure. But it really did save me.
I just want to add that I think this is probably true of a lot of toxic leaders when they feel threatened. She picked on and targeted the best officers, the most capable, the best leaders, the most knowledgeable. And so, you know, the people that she picked on were the highest performing and people that came to the ship with really stellar backgrounds, strong leadership, high competence in, you know, naval science. So I just wanted to point that out. I think that, you know, that was very threatening to her, as it probably would be to many toxic leaders when you have competent people underneath you.
I always felt that she was very intimidated, you know, especially by the LDOs and the warrants, who had a lot of experience and really didn't give a crap about what people thought. I can think of two particular people in mind. I'm sure Nicole knows who I'm thinking. I believe she was just intimidated by them because they were confident and they were very knowledgeable.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
You've all named a number of kind of the fallout, the effects of toxic leadership. John, do you feel like, do the higher ups understand that dynamic, really how destructive it is, and people's lives are shattered?
You know, I hope so. I'd like to think that everyone does. I think you know, one of the dynamics that you see in the Navy is the higher up you get, the less blunt the assessments come to you, right? Like as a staff officer now, I can even see it, you know, something starts out at the action officer level that this is terrible. And then at the mid level, it becomes, it's not good. And then the brief becomes good with some reservations when it gets to the flag. And so, and people are very hesitant to call out someone personally who's a peer, you know, as I was at the time. Literally, we were peers in command. When she had Winston Churchill, I had Oscar Austin, two ships of the same class, went through the school together. I never witnessed this behavior, but I certainly heard about it. And but you can't take hearsay up. And so, and again, who are the witnesses? It's the people that work for this person. And I think that's one of the challenges in this. I've had other discussions where, you know, we worship command almost in the Navy. Once you get that command pin, the Navy has put so much investment into you as a leader and as a tactician that it's a pretty high bar to have that taken away. And I think there's a lot of latitude given in the way people, you know, leadership styles, and you know, it'll be dismissed as, well, they're tough but fair, or yeah, boy, they're a real nail driver, you know, almost as if that's a good thing, which is fine unless you're the nail, right? But so I think they are aware, but when it gets down to that one case of that one person, there's probably somebody who thinks they're a good leader, and there's someone for whom they've worked for that didn't see that. And so it gets glossed over. You know, probably not to be left out of this conversation, Holly was one of the first women to command a destroyer, if not the first. And I think the Navy was under some pressure there to get to show some diversity in the Aegis program. And so, you know, I can't say whether that did or didn't play a role, but it, you know, it wouldn't shock me, I guess.
Yeah, John, I believe that did play a role. Curtis Wilbur was one of the first combatants to integrate women on board. I mean, Nicole was one of the first female division officers that came on board. I mean, out of the entire crew, I think we had 29 or 30 women total, officers and enlisted. And I know that Commander Graf was the first female XO of an Aegis ship, and then the first female XO of an Aegis DDG and a CG. And so I believe she was kind of protected, if you will, because, in my opinion, you know, the Navy didn't want to look bad by, you know, trying to get women out into combatants, and then they're can't think of a good word, but they're a shining example of a Navy surface warfare officer. Didn't quite make it, but they still pushed her through. And that's where the Navy failed, in my opinion.
I absolutely agree with that. And I wrote about that in Long Way Out, that I think you have to consider the time, the 90s, and the pressure the Navy was under to put women in command positions. And unfortunately, in this case, it was the wrong person. But yes, I just wanted to back that up.
Right. And so,
John, she was relieved of command, very serious matter. I mean, I'm not a Navy person, but I've read about it. I understand how serious that is. But she was given an honorable discharge. How can that be?
so,
We got 1 minute left on the time here.
okay.
You may want to disconnect and come back in if you want.